Bill Anderson has always been known for his whisper. A songwriter, a storyteller, a man who stood quietly at the center of country music's most powerful years. His words gave life to legends, yet his own voice often stayed in the background. But when it came to Tammy Wynette and George Jones, the couple fans once called the king and queen of country, Bill knew more than he ever let on. For decades he stayed silent, watching as Nashville painted a picture of romance, devotion, and timeless duets. A picture the world embraced. A picture that wasn't true. Now, at 86, Bill Anderson has finally chosen to speak. And what he reveals about Tammy, about George, and about the industry that shaped them both is not the fairy tale fans were told. It's a story of love twisted by fame, of promises broken, of truths buried for half a century. And from Bill's whisper comes a truth so powerful that once you hear it, you'll never look at Tammy Wynette and George Jones the same way again. Before he ever became a legend in his own right, Bill Anderson was simply a young man with a notebook full of words and a voice so soft people almost leaned in to hear him. Born in 1937, he came of age during the first great boom of country music. By the late 1950s, while still in college, he had already written City Lights, a song that became a #1 hit for Ray Price. That single piece of writing placed him inside Nashville's inner circle almost overnight. Suddenly, the boy they called Whisperin Bill was rubbing shoulders with the very people who would go on to define an entire generation of country music. Bill wasn't just another singer trying to chase the charts. He was something rarer, something Nashville always needed, but never had enough of. A writer who could put complicated human emotions into simple lines. His songs carried a kind of honesty that artists like Connie Smith, Lefty Frizzell, and later George Strait could take and make timeless. By the early 1960s, Bill was a fixture at the Grand Ole Opry, his soft voice standing in contrast to the booming powerhouses that filled the stage. He didn't command the audience with volume. He held them with sincerity. That sincerity meant he saw things others missed. Bill was never just a performer hidden in the spotlight. He was an observer, a listener. And in the smoky backrooms of the Opry, in the radio stations where DJs spun the latest hits, and in the Nashville offices where contracts were signed, he witnessed the unspoken truths of the industry. The truth that behind the rhinestones and stage lights, lives were messy, marriages were fragile, and the legends were just as human as anyone else. It was in this world that George Jones emerged as one of the most gifted, yet troubled voices country music would ever know. And it was here that Tammy Wynette, a young woman with an aching, powerful voice, arrived chasing her dream. Bill Anderson, already established, already respected, watched their rise. He saw their paths converge at the height of Nashville's golden age. When George and Tammy's relationship began, it seemed to fans like destiny. To those outside the circle, it was the ultimate fairy tale. Two voices meant to sing together, two stars meant to shine as one. But Bill knew better. From the moment their story began, he could sense the undercurrents. George, for all his brilliance, was unpredictable, consumed by alcohol and demons he could never quite outrun. Tammy, driven and ambitious, carried both fragility and fire. They were drawn to each other, yes, but in ways that promised sparks would not only light up the stage but burn down the walls around them. As a writer, Bill had always been tuned to the nuances of heartbreak. He saw the same patterns in George and Tammy's private lives that he had tried to capture in his songs. The longing, the pain, the contradiction of needing someone who also destroys you. To the outside world, their duets were love songs. To Bill and to those who stood close enough to the stage wings, they were cries for help wrapped in melody. He stayed silent. Nashville thrived on its myths, and Bill Anderson was not in the business of tearing down illusions. Not then. Instead, he wrote, he sang, he kept his place at the Opry, watching quietly as history unfolded in front of him. Yet even in his silence, he carried the weight of what he saw. He knew the story was not as simple as the song suggested. And as George and Tammy's names grew larger, as their marriage became the headline of country music, Bill Anderson held the truth in his quiet whisper. The truth that one day he would finally share. Audiences believed the legend of George and Tammy, but Bill knew the reality, and when he finally told it, the fairy tale would shatter. By the late 1960s, George Jones and Tammy Wynette were more than just rising stars, they were country royalty in the making. Nashville loved nothing more than a good story, and their pairing was the perfect one to sell. He was already a legend, a voice critics called one of the finest in the history of the genre. She was the new queen, her song Stand By Your Man turning into both a national anthem and a cultural lightning rod. Together they seemed unstoppable. The industry leaned hard into the image. Their photographs graced magazine covers, their duets filled the airwaves, and their tours became spectacles. Songs like We're Gonna Hold On and Golden Ring played not only as hits, but as soundtracks to a supposed love story everyone wanted to believe in. Bill Anderson, by then firmly rooted at the Grand Ole Opry and respected as one of country's finest songwriters, watched as the narrative was crafted. He knew how the business worked. Hits weren't enough. It was the story behind the voices that sold tickets, sold records, and captured hearts. And George and Tammy gave the business everything it wanted. To the public, they were the living embodiment of devotion, of passion so strong it transcended struggle. Fans clung to their image because it mirrored their own dreams, that true love could survive hard times. Couples in small towns across America saw themselves in George and Tammy, believing the music reflected reality. Every time they walked on stage, hand in hand, it reinforced the myth. But Bill Anderson, quiet in the wings, knew the myth was already beginning to fray. He had watched George long enough to understand that his drinking, his volatility, and his darker moods were never far away. He saw Tammy's ambition, her determination to succeed, and the toll it took on her personal life. The tension between them wasn't invisible. Insiders whispered about it in the dressing rooms and backstage corridors. Still, the machine rolled on. Nashville wasn't going to let cracks in the marriage get in the way of sales. The couple's troubles were kept behind closed doors, smoothed over by managers and publicists, hidden behind carefully staged interviews and glowing profiles in country music magazines. Bill, who had built a career on honesty in songwriting, saw the dishonesty in the industry's storytelling. Yet he said nothing. The public only saw the highlights. The dazzling duets on Hee Haw, the tender harmonies that made audiences weep, the glittering costumes and radiant smiles. To fans, George and Tammy weren't just stars, they were proof that love could be sung into reality. But those who stood closer, those like Bill who spent decades at the Opry watching colleagues unravel under the weight of fame, could feel the storm building. For Bill, it was a contradiction he carried quietly. He admired them both, George's unmatched artistry, Tammy's strength and resilience. But he also knew the pain hiding behind their songs. When Tammy sang of standing by her man, Bill understood it wasn't a declaration of devotion alone. It was a plea, a bargain with herself. When George sang about holding on, Bill knew it was less a promise and more a desperate hope. The fairy tale was working. Records were selling, audiences were enchanted, and Nashville crowned them the royal couple of country. Yet for those who had been around long enough, there was a familiar pattern forming. Bill had seen what fame and the relentless demands of the industry did to marriages before. He could see where this one was heading, even as the rest of the world cheered. To fans, George and Tammy were living the dream. But to Bill Anderson, who stood close enough to hear the cracks in the fairy tale, their love story was already turning into a tragedy. By the early 1970s, the cracks in George and Tammy's so-called fairy tale could no longer be patched over. What had once been sold to the world as the perfect love story was slowly unraveling, and those who knew them privately, Bill Anderson among them, saw the truth long before the headlines did. George Jones, despite his genius on stage and in the studio, was battling demons that refused to release him. Alcohol was his constant companion, turning his charm into volatility, his brilliance into unpredictability. Bill had seen this pattern before. In Nashville, stories of George's drinking were whispered with equal parts sadness and awe. Missing shows, vanishing for days, arriving on stage too impaired to perform. The legend of No-Show Jones was taking shape even as fans were still buying into the fairy tale marriage. Tammy Wynette, meanwhile, was reaching the peak of her fame. Songs like Divorce and Stand By Your Man carried her to heights few female country artists had ever reached. She became the voice of women across America, her words echoing both strength and sorrow. Yet behind the music, her own life was unraveling. Bill Anderson, a songwriter who had built his career on observing the truths people tried to hide, could see it clearly. Tammy's success came with a cost. Her marriage to George was straining under the weight of his addiction and her relentless drive to perform. Inside Nashville, people spoke of arguments that turned ugly, of Tammy leaving and returning, of George's inability to stay sober long enough to keep their family steady. To the outside world, they were still smiling in interviews, still standing side by side in glittering costumes. But for insiders like Bill, the facade was impossible to believe. He had shared stages, dressing rooms, and quiet moments with both of them. He saw the weariness in Tammy's eyes, the way she carried herself with determination while holding back exhaustion. He saw George's decline, the way his talent burned bright one night and collapsed into chaos the next. By 1975, the collapse was official. George and Tammy's divorce became public knowledge, shocking fans who had believed in their myth of everlasting devotion. Bill Anderson wasn't surprised. He had watched the warning signs build for years. He had remained silent, not because he didn't care, but because he understood the unwritten rules of Nashville. Family troubles were kept behind closed doors, and industry friends protected each other's reputations. But silence didn't mean ignorance. Bill carried the truth quietly, recognizing how deeply the divorce cut through both of them. Tammy, despite her outward strength, was left heartbroken, yet determined to keep her career moving forward. George spiraled further, his drinking worsening, his reputation suffering. For fans, it was a tragedy. For Bill Anderson, it was a confirmation of what he already knew. Behind the songs and the staged smiles, their marriage had been crumbling long before the world admitted it. Even in the heartbreak, their music continued to tell the story the industry wanted. Duets like Golden Ring, released after their divorce, were marketed as if the love was still alive, as if the fairy tale hadn't shattered. Bill Anderson, himself a master of writing songs that captured complicated emotions, understood the irony better than anyone. Nashville had turned their private collapse into public profit. The divorce shocked fans, but not Bill Anderson. He had seen the storm coming long before the papers were signed, and he knew the lies that would follow would be even harder to bear. The divorce of George Jones and Tammy Wynette in 1975 should have ended the story. By all rights, it was the final chapter of a love affair too fragile to survive. But in Nashville, endings were rarely final, and the truth was rarely told. To the industry, George and Tammy weren't just two people, they were a brand, a profitable one. And even after the marriage collapsed, the machine refused to let their myth die. Their duets still sold. Their names, when placed side by side on a poster, still filled concert halls. And so the narrative was carefully maintained. George and Tammy, the eternal couple, still singing of love and devotion even as they lived separate lives. The most striking example came in 1976, when Golden Ring shot to #1. The song told of a wedding band and the cycle of love gained and lost. To fans, it felt like a continuation of their romance, proof that even after divorce, Their voices and perhaps their hearts remained intertwined. But to Bill Anderson, who knew what had really happened, it was another reminder of how deeply Nashville relied on illusion. Bill had spent his life writing songs that came from lived experience, from real emotions. He understood better than anyone that music could carry both truth and artifice. When he watched George and Tammy's post-divorce collaborations climb the charts, he knew what fans did not: that behind those haunting harmonies was a fractured past, rehearsed in the studio but impossible to reconcile in real life. To the industry, it didn't matter. Heartbreak sold records just as well as romance, and in some ways even better. The lies weren't malicious in the usual sense. They were commercial. Nashville polished, packaged, and sold the version of George and Tammy that the world wanted to believe in. The brokenness, the addiction, the arguments, the despair. None of that was for public consumption. Instead, the public was handed the story of two voices destined to sing together forever, even if the reality was far darker. Bill Anderson, who stood in the wings for decades, recognized the pattern. He had seen the same story before. Talented artists, consumed by an image larger than life, an image they could never sustain in private. For fans, the deception lasted. Many believed until their dying day that George and Tammy's duets were honest expressions of a love that endured. Bill knew otherwise. He knew the cost Tammy paid, continuing to perform even when her personal life was unraveling. He knew the pain George carried, numbing himself with the bottle as his career faltered. He knew too how Nashville's insistence on maintaining the myth meant their humanity was stripped away, replaced with a story too good to be true. In time, the truth would surface in fragments, biographies, interviews, whispered recollections. But for nearly 50 years, the myth remained stronger than the reality. And Bill Anderson, the songwriter who made his career turning human frailty into timeless lyrics, carried the weight of knowing just how much had been hidden. He did not speak. Not then, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because even he understood that country music needed its legends, even if the legends were built on lies. The world sang along to George and Tammy's story, never realizing how much of it was a carefully crafted illusion. Bill Anderson saw it all, and when he finally broke his silence, he exposed the truth Nashville had been hiding for half a century. For decades, Bill Anderson stayed quiet. He wrote his songs, played his shows, and carried on his career while the story of George Jones and Tammy Wynette was told by others, by record labels, by journalists, by fans who wanted to believe the myth. His voice, the whisper that had given him his name, remained still on the subject. But time has a way of softening silence. And by the time he reached his later years, Bill no longer felt bound by the unspoken rules of Nashville. When Bill looked back on George and Tammy, he didn't speak with cruelty or bitterness. He spoke with the perspective of a man who had lived long enough to see both the beauty and the destruction of country music's golden age. He remembered George not only as a man undone by drink, but as the greatest voice country music had ever known. He remembered Tammy not only as a woman trapped in a turbulent marriage, but as the embodiment of resilience, a singer who turned her pain into anthems that still resonate. Yet Bill did not shy away from the darker parts of their story. He acknowledged what fans had long suspected but never fully knew: that the George and Tammy sold to the public was a version polished beyond recognition. Their marriage was not a fairy tale, it was a battlefield, and Nashville, in its hunger for profit, chose to hide the wreckage while continuing to exploit the romance. Bill admitted that for years he protected that truth, understanding that to speak out would have been seen as betrayal. But with the passage of time, he recognized that silence had become its own kind of lie. In memoirs and interviews, Bill's words carried the quiet weight of someone who had been there, who had seen it firsthand. He didn't gossip, didn't sensationalize. Instead, he offered clarity. He spoke of how hard Tammy fought to balance her career and her personal life, of how George wrestled with demons larger than himself, and of how the industry used both of them as symbols while ignoring their pain. His revelations were less about scandal and more about honesty, the kind of honesty that had always defined his songwriting. For Bill, breaking his silence was about legacy. He wanted the world to remember George and Tammy as more than caricatures of love and disaster. He wanted people to see the human beings behind the myth, flawed yet gifted, broken yet unforgettable. In doing so, he also revealed something about himself, that even the quietest man in the room sometimes carries the loudest truths. The impact of his words was profound. Fans who had grown up believing in the fairy tale of George and Tammy were forced to reckon with the reality that Nashville had lied to them for 50 years. Yet rather than destroy the legend, Bill's honesty deepened it. It made the songs more powerful, the performances more haunting, the story more real. Because in the end, truth carries a weight that myths cannot. And so, at 86, Bill Anderson finally spoke. His whisper became a revelation, a reminder that even the most carefully guarded myth cannot survive forever. Bill Anderson's life has always been measured not in volume but in truth. His whisper carried further than most shouts because it was rooted in honesty, and when he finally broke his silence about George Jones and Tammy Wynette, he did what he had always done best. He told the story as it really was, not the fairy tale, not the polished myth, but the human struggle at the heart of their lives. By speaking out, Bill reminded the world that legends are not perfect. George and Tammy were not invincible lovers, destined for eternity. They were two flawed people, bound together by music and undone by the weight of their own pain. The industry may have lied for 50 years, but Bill Anderson's late-life candor ensured that the truth would not be buried forever. In his whisper we hear not only the story of George and Tammy, but the story of country music itself, its beauty, its heartbreak, its ability to turn even the deepest wounds into songs that endure. And in the end, that may be the greatest truth of all. For more emotional stories, check out this video.